So, these two jabronis right here are waving around this grand jury report. So, I read the whole thing, and like anything you'd expect out of these two, it's filled with disinformation. But let's tear it down piece by piece. But first, let's talk about what they think that they showed. They think that lockdowns and mask mandates cause more collateral damage than good, where the grand jury identified anxiety, depression, suicide behavior, and attention deficits as attributed to the heavy-handed policies of lockdowns. They think they showed that lockdowns resulted in higher excess mortality rates. They think they showed that there is uncertainty about the effects of face masks. And the jury concluded that there has never been sound evidence that face masks provide statistically significant effectiveness against the virus. And they think that the CDC's COVID-19 hospitalization data is likely inflated. Well, this is the report right here. Let's go through it, but first, let's talk about what this even is. This is the Florida Grand Jury Handbook. It tells us all of these things. First, a Florida grand jury consists of citizens. These citizens are at least 18 years of age who possess a driver's license or ID card. The grand jury consists of 18 members. Where the grand jury does not try a case on the issue of guilt, the grand jury actually rarely hears both sides. Its function is to simply hear witnesses as to a charge of crime by the state. So by definition, this is a biased committee by the presentation of facts being only from the state, aka Florida. Where the grand jury, as an investigative body, makes investigations on its own, which it will report as a presentment, which is what this is. However, most of the work of the grand jury involves hearing witnesses and determining the sufficiency of evidence on the issue, without regard to possible defenses. So they decide if the evidence that is being selectively presented to them justifies indictment. That's what the grand jury does. And if the grand jury finds an unlawful, improper, or corrupt condition exists, it may recommend remedy. Because this grand jury is not a real lawmaking body, it cannot create any legal action. All it can do is recommend to the state what they think their findings are. And before we fully dive into this, we need to get a little background context. This report is focusing on the stay-at-home order for COVID that was issued in 2020, and also school closures for the 2020-2021 semester period. Well, I went through and compiled all the states and when their stay-at-home order started, as well as when it was lifted. Where the majority of states only imposed a stay-at-home order for about 6 weeks, where 7 states actually never shut down. And specifically for Florida, which is what this grand jury is looking at, they only imposed a stay-at-home order for 31 days, or about 4.5 months. I also compiled this data for school closures, where on average schools were closed for about 156 days, which correlates to 22 weeks. However, most of the schools closed in mid-March or early April. And as summer for K through 12 starts around June, this only equated to about a 2 to 3 month learning loss in most cases, as schools started back up again in the fall semester. So Florida in particular only had about 2.5 months of learning loss. Now that we have the background context for all this, we can finally dive in. Where the entire purpose of this document is a presentment to raise public awareness. So this is a dog and pony show. And again, this grand jury only has the power to recommend solutions. They cannot enact them. Where they have a completely slanted premise, where the question is they're looking at the safety and efficacy of COVID-19 vaccines, ultimately deeming it to be in the public interest to impanel a statewide grand jury to investigate criminal or wrongful activity in Florida relating to the development, promotion, and distribution of these vaccines, with the focus to be looking at pharmaceutical manufacturers and their executive officers to see if they engaged in criminal activity or wrongdoing. And of note, nothing in this document looks at anything that the pharmaceutical manufacturers said or claimed. They do not look at the efficacy of the vaccines, the uptake or adherence of Floridians, or anything of that nature. Now, the easiest critique of this document is that they don't cite any of their sources. Here's a fantastic example of this on page 8. So in February 2020, a study of passengers on the Diamond Princess cruise ship, later papers have given wider estimates. For example, a journal article published in March 2022, so they're not listing the journal source, they're not listing the authors, they're not listing the title of the paper, and there is no citations list so people can cross-reference what they were looking at and what they're presenting on. Next, pretty much every single study that they reference is a 2020 study. They completely neglect anything that is current. And in my opinion, the reason they're focusing on these 2020 studies is because, one, that's when the stay-at-home orders were, which they conflate as lockdowns. Where again, in Florida, this only lasted 31 days from April 3rd to May 4th. And that's also when the highest level of uncertainty in what we know is right at the beginning, when we don't know anything about a new disease, and we've slowly gained information over the past 5 years. So it's very important to keep in context that this is a 2024 report, and they're focusing heavily on 2020, which gives a very skewed perspective. Starting off with safety and efficacy of vaccines, all of these statements listed are true things. The only thing that I will give them is CDC Director Rochelle Walensky's comment on, I think, the Rachel Maddow show, where she said that the vaccine will prevent COVID-19 disease. Well, that was false. The CDC actually had to walk back her statements. That's the only one I'll give them in this list. Everything else here is true, especially it isn't just about protecting you, but also your community. Where on page 6 they claim that as a practical matter, one cannot determine the truth of any statement touting the safety or efficacy of COVID-19 vaccines, and that statement is patently false. This is a paper showing that even immunocompromised individuals can develop a good immune response after 3 to 4 vaccinations. This is a paper on the safety profile of vaccines and adverse reactions. And here's another one that looks at the safety of vaccines in pregnancy. This is a good paper on the efficacy, showing the additive effects of boosters for immunization for immunocompromised and elderly individuals. And this is another one that shows that vaccination is very advantageous for providing broad immunity. And those are just a couple papers that are recent that can show you that you are wrong. They also make a claim that the danger posed by the virus has been diminished to a greater or lesser extent over the years due to the development of effective treatments, non-pharmaceutical interventions, and evolving population-level immunity. In terms of treatments, we have 3 antivirals, with Paxlovid being the major one. These are largely inaccessible because doctors are refusing to prescribe them. The cost out of pocket is around $1,400, and things with the insurance companies are in flux. Non-pharmaceutical interventions like masks are fantastic, but there are no mask mandates in effect. Additionally, only 15% of the population got the bivalent booster, and only about 17 to 21% of the population currently has the XBB 1.5 booster, or vaccine. Furthermore, we're starting to see in the literature that getting a COVID infection is, 1, depleting your immune system, your T and B cells, and 2, we're starting to see that in some studies, like the last one I presented to you, that perhaps getting an XBB 1.5 infection does not necessarily even confer immunity to that variant. So wrong, wrong, and wrong. Next is a section on hospitalization risk, and they make unfounded claims. So within the CARES Act, the federal government created financial subsidies for Medicare and Medicaid patients with COVID-19 that were treated at hospitals and other medical facilities, where the grand jury says it's clear that these CARES Act subsidy payments helped to relieve the financial risk of their closure or collapse for the hospitals. But then they claim that putting that money on offer creates incentives to report more than just hospitalizations for COVID-19 disease, where the hospitals could list incidental COVID infection versus someone who was very sick with symptoms of COVID that required hospitalization. This is a chicken and the egg fallacy. For instance, if you're in prolonged kidney failure and then you get COVID, the COVID could be what's pushing you over the edge that requires hospitalization and the need for immediate transplant. Unless you individually went case by case and made the distinction in every single instance, this cannot be separated. Because as COVID is a vascular disease, how do you differentiate between it being the needle that broke the camel's back versus a concurrent, non-important factor in a person's disease presentation? The answer is this can't be done. So you can make this claim, but unless you go through and show some numbers and show that this actually happened, that this fraud existed, which you did not, then this is just a fallacious claim. And the exact same logic to fallaciously claim fraud was used for COVID deaths, where the exact opposite claim was recently found. The study estimated about 1.2 million excess natural cause deaths during the first 30 months of the pandemic, with at least 163,000 of these not listed as COVID-19 on the death certificates. This is just one of many. Multiple studies have shown that the federal counts are vastly undercounted, not overcounted. On page 13, they equate stay-at-home orders and school closures to lockdowns, which we already showed they are not. But again, the stay-at-home duration was only 31 days in Florida, and due to the timing of summer, they only missed about 2.5 months of learning, aka 2.5 months of school closures. That's it. On page 18, they list these mental health issues, stating that long COVID may experience many symptoms related to brain function and mental health, and that not all mental health symptoms are attributable to the virus. We have direct evidence that the COVID virus causes brain damage, where autopsies have shown COVID in the brain and brainstem, fusion of neurons which disrupts the pathways, and more. Follow me over to part 2 as we tear this apart even more.